line with the productive capacity of the society. In other words, population growth could not resume until the problem of elite overproduction was somehow solved. For a variety of reasons, it took an unusually long time for this to happen. By 1485, however, economic hardship and internal warfare during the 14th and 15th centuries had pruned the size of the English ruling class to roughly one-third of what it was in the early 14th century. Thus, the numbers of magnates declined from about 200 barons to some 60 lay peers. The middle ranks, knights and esquires, shrank from 3,000 to 1,300, and the numbers of lesser gentry declined from perhaps 15,000 to 5,000. See tables 2.10 and 2.11. Another aspect of the same process was the decline of the extreme economic inequality that developed in England by 1300. At the lower end of the social hierarchy, population decline greatly increased land-peasant ratios and improved consumption patterns of even the poor. At the higher end, the huge fortunes of the 14th century, such as that of the Earls of Lancaster, 11,000 in 1311, or the Dukes of Lancaster, 12,500 in 1394, were gone by the 15th century. Thus, the maximum income assessed in 1436, Gray 1934, was £3,230, belonging to Richard of York, well below that of even the Earls of Cornwall of the early 14th century, £6,000 in 1300. The other incomes over £3,000 were those of the Earl of Warwick and the Duke of Buckingham. By contrast, around 1300 there were 6 earls who enjoyed an income of more than £3,000 per year. Later in the 15th century, even these fortunes tended to disappear. The York inheritance was merged into the crown as a result of Richard of York's son being crowned Edward IV in 1461. The Warwick fortune was absorbed by the crown after 1471, when Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was killed in battle fighting against Edward IV. But the theory does not capture all the complexities of the historical process. We need to stress 2 important qualifications to our generally positive assessment of the fit between the theory and data in the case of the plantar-genet cycle: the importance of exogenous factors and the operation of other endogenous processes that are not, strictly speaking, part of the demographic structural theory. One important exogenous factor was the influence of climate. The cold and wet years after 1315 apparently served as a trigger for the beginning of population decline. The global cooling following the medieval optimum MEDIEVALENGLAND 79 probably depressed crop yields and therefore decreased the carrying capacity of the medieval early modern agrarian system. An even more obviously important exogenous shock was administered by the arrival of the Eurasia-wide plague pandemic in England in 1348. Although it is likely that population would have continued to decline even in the absence of the Black Death, it would probably have declined much more slowly and not as deeply as it actually did. The geopolitical situation of England with respect to its neighbours, Scotland and France, is another exogenous factor of great importance. As we argued above, it was the dealings with France that served to lengthen the disintegrative phase of the Plantagenet cycle. Turning now to endogenous factors, we note that standard demographic structural models predict continuous socio-political instability and a gradual numerical decline of the ruling class. Yet, in actuality, instability waxes and wanes in waves, interspersed with relatively peaceful periods in between. This is a general occurrence during the disintegrative phases of many secular cycles, and has been termed the fathers and sons cycle. Turchin, 2003b, 2006. In the case of Plantagenet England, there were 3 such fathers and sons cycles, which interacted in a repeatable way with changes in England's geopolitical environment. The essential dynamic of each cycle was 1. A centripetal phase, characterized by unified elites, increased taxation, and success in external wars, followed by 2. A centrifugal phase, characterized by state fiscal problems, intra-like competition, shading into civil war, and loss of external conquests. The basic dynamic was set during the reigns of Edward I, 1272 to 1307, and his son, Edward II, 1307 to 27. Edward I reversed a century-long decline in crown revenues, see figure 2.6, and conquered Scotland, profiting from its collapse into civil war. Edward II, in contrast, presided over an increasingly fractious nobility and declining revenues.
He experienced a disastrous defeat at the hands of the Scots at Bannockburn, 1314, and lost Scotland. Finally, he lost his crown and his life as a result of the civil wars of the 1320s. The next iteration of the same pattern came with the reigns of Edward III, 1327–77, and Richard II, 1377–99. Edward III unified the elites, achieved the highest rate of taxation in medieval English history, and conquered half of France. His successor, Richard II, alienated a major segment of the nobility and executed some of them. His reign saw declining revenues and the refusal of parliaments to vote more taxes, along with widespread popular uprisings. Like Edward II, he was overthrown and later died, possibly murdered, in prison. CHAPTER 280.
The last cycle was the combined Lancastrian and Yorkist period. During the reign of Henry V and the infancy of Henry VI, England experienced a period of national unification, relative fiscal stability, and successful conquest in France. Beginning in the 1430s, however, it gradually slid into state bankruptcy, intrialite conflict, territorial loss in France, and finally all-out civil war. The last battle of the Wars of the Roses in 1485 was not only the end of the third mini-cycle of fathers and sons, it was also the end of the grand secular cycle of Plantagenet England. Chapter 3. Early Modern England, the Tudor-Stuart Cycle, 1485 to 1730. 3.1 Overview of the cycle. As the start of the cycle, we take the year when the Tudor dynasty was established, marking the end of the long period of instability that culminated in the Wars of the Roses. The year 1485 is also a good candidate for a turning point in the population history of England, when the medieval population depression was succeeded by the first signs of demographic growth. The end of the cycle is harder to pinpoint. We chose 1730 because that was the last quinquennium of negative population growth in Wrigley et al. 1997 data, but another possible endpoint is 1750, since sustained population growth resumed only after that date. The secular cycle encompasses the Tudor, Stuart, and the beginning of the Hanoverian dynasties. Trends in population and economy. The population trajectory of early modern England was dominated by two trends: sustained population growth between the early 16th century and the mid-17th century, followed by population stagnation until the mid-18th century, figure 3.1a. One factor that we need to take into account in order to interpret the observed pattern is the acceleration of scientific and technical progress, which eventually, after our period, culminated in the Industrial Revolution. The chief enabling factor of the Industrial Revolution was the great progress in agricultural productivity that began during the 17th century, figure 3.1a. Increasing average yields of an acre of cropland meant that English agriculture could feed more people. In other words, the carrying capacity began increasing soon after 1600. The main variable in the Malthusian-Ricardian theory is not the total number of people, but the number of people in relation to resources, or the population pressure on resources. Population pressure can be estimated by dividing actual population numbers by the maximum number that can be fed within a certain geographic region given current technology. The appendix at the end of this chapter calculates the carrying capacity of England, CHA PTER 382. Figure 3.1, Detrending Population Trajectory for England. Turchin 2005, see also the appendix at the end of this chapter. A. Population numbers in millions, net yields in bushels per acre, and estimated carrying capacity in millions of people in England, 1450 to 1800, all variables plotted on a log scale. B. Detrended population, population pressure. Trajectory, solid line, and inverse real wages, dashed line. As a function of changing yields per acre of cropland, and figure 3.1b plots the dynamics of population pressure between 1450 and 1800. We see that at the same time that population numbers stagnated, tie-in pressure decreased substantially owing to increasing agricultural productivity of cropland. As a result, between the late 15th century and the mid-18th century, population pressure, but not numbers, traced out a typical secular cycle. To check on our calculations, We also plotted the misery index, inverse real wage, in figure 3.1b. The general parallelism between the two curves supports our procedure for estimating the popular tie-in pressure EARLYMODERNENGLAND 83. Figure 3.2 Dynamics of Prices, Decadal Averages in England, 1450 to 1800. Solid line, the price of wheat in silver equivalents, Abel 1980. Dashed line, CPI of a basket of consumables, Allen 1992. This period also saw a very rapid inflation, the famous price revolution of the 16th century, figure 3.2. Between the 1540s and 1600, the price of wheat quadrupled, from 20 to over 80 grams of silver per quintal, 100 kilograms. At its peak in the 1640s, and again in the 1690s, the price of wheat exceeded 120 grams per quintal, a six-fold increase over the century since 1540. Social structure and elite dynamics. The apex of the social hierarchy in early modern England was occupied by the magnates, the lay peers, barons, viscounts, earls, and dukes, the spiritual lords, archbishops and bishops, top government administrators, and influential court figures. The number of peers during the Tudor cycle var IED between fewer than 60 and 170, table 3.1a. There were fewer than 30 bishops and no abbots after the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. Not only did the numbers of the higher clergy decline after the Reformation, but their social status was considered inferior to that of lay peers, Stone 1976, colon 241. The bulk of the middle rank elites consisted of the county gentry, squires, knights, and later baronets, numbering between 1,300 and 4,400, table 3.1b. The numbers of the lesser elites, the parish gentry, varied between 5,000 and 15,000, table 3.1c. In addition to the landed gentry, the elite stratum included lawyers above the barrister level, the urban elites, CHAPTER 384. Table 3.1. The numbers and average incomes of elites during the Tudor-Stuart cycle. Period number average income pounds, income quarters, tons of wheat. A. Magnates, peers. 1,560, 1,540, 60, 400 to 1,400 or 1,000 to 3,500, 220 to 760, 1,655, 1,615, 81, 1,628, 126, 1,640, 166,000 B, 2,600, 500, 7,770. B. Middle ranks, county elites. 1,500, 1,300 county gentry, 500 knights, 800 esquires, 1,524 or 1,300, 500 knights, 120 to 200, 320 to 500, 70 to 115, 800 esquires, 50 to 80, 130 to 210, 28 to 46, 16, 44,400, 1,400 baronets and knights, 500 to 1,220 to 430, 48 to 94 knights, 3,000 esquires. 100 to 300, 45 to 130, 10 to 28, 1,700, 3,000, 1,000 greater gentry, 2,000 lesser gentry. C. Lesser elites, parish gentry. 1,500 gentlemen, 1764, 1415, 45,000 armigerous gentry, 1640, 15,000 armigerous gentry, less than 100, less than 43, 9, 1700, 10,000 country gentlemen, 240,122. Sources. For magnates, Mingai, 1976. A data for 1524 from Britnell, 1997, colon 191. B. Data for 1640 from Stone, 1965, colon 762. Wholesalers, large-scale exporters, customs farmers, and financiers, and the parish clergy. As to commoners, Stone, 1976, colon 240, describes a tripartite division. 1. The lesser and the more substantial yeomen, the husbandmen, the artisans, shopkeepers, and small traders. 2. The living-out labourers, both rural and urban, agricultural and industrial. And 3. The apprentices and living-in servants, and those dependent on charity, widows, the aged, and the unemployed. Before 1540, the numbers of aristocrats of all ranks stayed flat, table 3.1. Between 1540 and 1640, however, elite numbers roughly tripled, because the general population increased during this period by only 80%. From 2.8 million to 5.1 million, English society became significantly more EAR, Li, Mo, D, RN, NGL, and D 85, top heavy. After 1640, the numbers of middle rank and lesser elites declined by about one-third, while the number of peers continued to grow, although at a much slower rate than before 1640. The changes affecting lesser clergy were more complex. There were 9,000 to 10,000 parishes in medieval England. Mormon 1946:5. Toward the end of the Plantagenet cycle, however, a high proportion of parishes did not have a resident curate or even a parish church. During the disturbed period of 1540 to 60, there was a sharp decline in the number entering ministry. Stone 1972-80. In the Diocese of Canterbury, of 274 documented livings, 107 were without an incumbent in 1560. In the Archdeaconry of Oxford, the number of rectors, vicars, and curates declined from 371 in 1526 to 270 in 1586. Stone 1972-80. After 1600, the numbers of local clergy increased very rapidly, and by 1640 there were not enough livings to satisfy the demand. In 1688, Gregory King estimated there were 10,000 clergy in England, an estimate revised to 12,000 by Lindert and William Sun, 1982. Thus the numbers of lesser clergy at least doubled since 1500. But the numbers do not tell the whole story. The quality and status, though not income, of parish clergy rose during the early 17th century. The late medieval parish priest was little more than a semi-literate dirt farmer of dubious morals. The Caroline minister of a parish had a university degree, strong religious convictions, a comfortable house, some books on his shelves. Stone 1972-81. In other words, during the 17th century, employment as a parochial clergyman became a spillover reservoir for surplus elites. State finances. In nominal terms, the state revenues continued to increase throughout the cycle, with what appear to be minor fluctuations around the trend. When deflated by the price of wheat, however, the pattern of change becomes more complex. Figure 3.3. During the first phase, until around 1550, real revenues increased more than threefold. During the second half of the 16th century, the trend inverted, and the purchasing power of crown revenues lost two-thirds of its value. This reversal was entirely due to the price inflation of the 16th century. Between 1600 and 1640 revenues fluctuated at a low level. Interestingly, because population continued to increase, on the eve of the Great Revolution, per capita tax rates declined to half of what they were in the late 15th century. The Revolution saw the first spurt of increase, followed by a slight decline under the Restoration. Finally, there was a great and sustained growth in real revenues in the decades around 1700, which finally took them to levels beyond the mid-16th century peak, figure 3.3. CHAPTEREESEVENTYSIX. Figure 3.3, total revenues of the English state, 1485 to 1755, ESFDB 1995. Dotted line, revenues expressed in silver equivalent. Solid line, revenues in terms of wheat. Dashed line, real per capita revenues. Sociopolitical stability. The period between the end of the Wars of the Roses and the onset of the Great Revolution was quite peaceful. Table 3.2. A partial exception was the 2 decades in the mid-16th century, which were characterized by dynastic instability, religious strife, and financial difficulties. The so-called mid-Tudor crisis. Jones, 1973. This instability, however, never escalated into a full-blown crisis. Matusiak, 2005. A series of rebellions that flared up between 1536 and 1554, the Pilgrimage of Grace, the Cornwall Rising, Kett's and Wyatt's rebellions, were regional in character, did not seriously threaten the central authorities, and were rapidly suppressed. Loads 1999, 150, 53, 173, 177-78, 193-95. The period of 1640 to 60, by contrast, saw a full-scale state collapse, followed by a lengthy and bitter civil war. There was a relatively peaceful interlude during the Restoration, which was followed by a second period of instability, involving violent overthrow of the government during 1685 to 92, Table 3.2. The 18th century was very peaceful, apart from two Jacobite risings in Scotland, which were rapidly suppressed. The coin hoard's trajectory during 1500 to 1800 is dominated by the peak associated with the Great Revolution, figure 3.4. Two secondary peaks, EARLYMODERNENGLAND 87. Table 3.2, occurrence of rebellions, coup d'etat, civil wars, and other instances of internal war in England, 1500 to 1603, and England and Scotland, 1603 to 1800. Period description. 1536 to 37 Pilgrimage of Grace, the Catholic Rebellion in Yorkshire. 1549 to 50 Kett's Rebellion, Cornwall Rising. 1554. Wyatt's Rebellion, 1639 to 40 Scottish Rebellion. The Bishops' Wars, 1642 to 47 Civil War. 1648 to 51 Second Civil War, 1655 Penruddock Rising in Salisbury, 1660 Monk's Coup. Restoration of James II, 1666. Revolt of Scottish Covenanters, 1679. Revolt of Scottish Covenanters, 1685. Monmouth and Argyll Rebellions, 1687 to 92. Glorious Revolution, with intervention by France, 1715 to 16. Jacobite Rebellion in Scotland, 1745 to 46 Scottish Rising, Jacobite Pretender. Sources after Sorokin, 1937, and Tilley, 1993, supplemented by Stearns, 2001, are also present. One of them reflects the second period of socio-political instability associated with the Glorious Revolution. Another one, in the mid-16th century, probably has less to do with internal instability in England, although this period includes Wyatt's Rebellion, than with events outside it, the English-Scottish Succession War and suppression of a major rebellion in Ireland. 3.2 Expansion, 1485 to 1580. General population and economy. After a long period of stagnation, the population of England began expanding sometime around 1500. Some scholars point to the 1480s as the time when the population started to increase, others to the 1510s. Hatcher, 1977. Certainly by the 1520s, the population was increasing briskly. Britnell, 1997:246. We lack good population data for the period before 1540, but one indirect sign of expansion is the jump in the replacement rates detected in the Inquisition's post-mortem around 1500. But these data primarily tell us what was happening with the landed elites. Another sign is the intense rebuilding activity by peasants of their houses, with a concentration of new construction in the period 1440 to 1520, Dyer 2002, 356. This was followed by a rebuilding of thousands of parish churches between 1480 and 1540, Hoskins 1976:12. The final indication is the price inflation of Chapter 388. Figure 3.4 number of coin hoards per decade in the British Isles, 1500 to 1800, Brown 1971. Thick, solid line. England, including Wales, until 1707, after that United Kingdom includes Scotland. Thin, solid line, Scotland until 1707. Dotted line, Ireland. 1500 to 1530, accompanied by a sluggish response of the wages, Britnell 1997, 244. In fact, 1500 appears to be the turnaround point when the Miss Erie Index, inverse real wage, began a sustained ascent, figure 3.1. An analysis of lay subsidies of 1524 and 1525 suggests a population of 2.3 million people, Cornwall 1970, which is the same as the estimated minimum during the 15th century. A later re-evaluation suggests an even lower number, Campbell 1981, which is, however, difficult to reconcile with the firmer estimate of 2.8 million people in 1541. A population increase from 2.3 to 2.8 million between the 1520s and the 1540s implies a relative growth rate of 1% per year, which is somewhat above the growth rate after 1540, for which we have solid data. The back projection suggests that the annual rate of population growth between 1541 and 1556 was 0.87%. Wrigley and Schofield, 1981, 566. One important aspect of the early stages of population expansion was that it was accompanied by a significant shift in the urban-rural population balance. With the exception of London, it appears that all English towns lost population between 1400 and the middle of the 16th century. For example, Coventry, the dominant town of the Midlands, managed to expand its population between 1348 and 1450, despite the ravages of the early modern England 89. Black Death. In 1440, its population was over 10,000, and in 1500 only slightly less, 8,500 to 9,000. However, in 1520 the population was only 7,500, and by the mid-16th century it had collapsed to 4,000 to 5,000, Fithy and Adams, 1979-281. Coventry was not an unusual example. Other cities that lost about half their population between 1377 and 1525 were Winchester, York, Boston, Lincoln, and Lynn. Dyer, 2002, 300. Leicester, Norwich, Bristol, Southampton, Salisbury, and Hereford all shrank severely or experienced serious economic difficulties. Fithy and Adams, 1979, 283 to 84. Dyer, 2002, 300. The population of London, the only exception to this pattern, grew during this period, but slower than the overall population. A number of towns simply stopped being towns, either because their inhabitants deserted them or because they ceased to have an urban economy. Dyer, 1980, 301. This trend was particularly severe in the west and north of Britain. The general dynamic underlying deurbanization was the reverse of the trend observed during the stagflation phase of the previous cycle. A shrunken elite stratum coupled with reduced consumption levels by an AV-erage elite household translated into a depressed demand for luxuries and manufactures. As a result, towns offered reduced employment opportunities to potential immigrants from rural areas. Meanwhile, rural areas became more attractive places to live as political stability returned under the Tudor regime. There arose new possibilities of expanding the carrying capacity by internal colonization of previously abandoned lands. Thus, both pull and push factors aligned to reduce the inflow of rural migrants to towns. As a result, urban populations shrank because of high mortality and the low birth rates prevailing in pre-modern towns. Incidentally, this redistribution of population between urban and rural locations may help explain why it is so difficult to directly document the early phase of popular. Tie-in increase, 1480 to 1540. Unlike urban shrinking, rural recolonization is not easily detectable, except by using indirect measures, such as peasant house construction and parish church rebuilding. Whatever the timing and tempo of the early population expansion, by 1541 the total was 2.8 million, Wrigley et al. 1997, a substantial increase over the 15th century level. Thanks to excellent research by the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure, the population trajectory of post-1540 England is well known. After 1540, popular tie-in grew at an accelerating rate, which exceeded 1% per year in 1580. After 1580, population continued to grow, crossing the 4 million threshold in the early 1590s, but at a declining rate. Rapid population growth during the second half of the 16th century, combined with torrents of precious metals from the New World, drove prices to unprecedented levels. At the same time, nominal wages CHAPTER 390 increased at a much slower rate, with dire consequences for commoner standards of life. In the early 16th century, before the price revolution, a labourer's wages provided for a standard of life that was modest but well above the starvation level. Assuming that a worker could find employment for 150 days a year, and that the daily wage rate was 4D, Hoskins, 1976, 113, estimated the annual income of 50 shillings. Master craftsmen would be paid 50% more since their daily wage was 6D. 5 quarters of wheat, 14.5 hectoliters, a reasonable index of food consumption for a family of 5, would cost 30 shillings and would take 60% of the annual income. Other expenses were much smaller. The typical rent was 5 shillings per year. Working class clothing cost 4 shillings per person per year, but it is unlikely that labourers spent that much. Most clothing was probably made at home, and poor people wore others' cast-offs. A pair of shoes for poor people cost a shilling. Where woodland was within easy access, the poor collected wood for fuel. Where woodland was scarce, they burned the dried haulms of peas and beans and even dried cow dung, Hoskins 1976, 116, or did not heat their dwellings at all. Life was not easy, but the labourers' wages were sufficient for food and basic shelter. Additionally, the wife and children could supplement the family income, either by working in the textile industry or by seasonal employ. Meant in agriculture. During the 16th century, wages grew slower than prices, collapsing in real terms. For example, the agricultural wage in southern England stayed constant at 4 pence per day until 1550, and then grew to 8 pence per day by the 1580s and 1590s. Thirsk, 1967, 864. The purchasing power of the wage rate, however, had declined by 50% by the 1590s. Thirsk, 1967, 865. Land rents rose, but initially slower than prices, shifting the distribution of agricultural profits from the landlord to the tenant. Stone, 1972:68. As we shall discuss below, during the stagflation phase, rents increased faster than prices, and the direction of the flow of profits was reversed. Elites. Until the middle of the 16th century, the expansion of elite numbers lagged behind general population growth. Throughout most of the century, the numbers of peers fluctuated near 60, Mingai, 1976. The numbers of knights increased from 375 in 1490 to 600 in 1560, Stone, 1965, 71%, an increase of only 60%, while the population more than doubled. In the mid-16th century, the elite fortunes were dramatically changed by the greatest land transfer in the English history after the Norman conquest, the dissolution of monasteries. The net yearly income of the church was estimated by Hoskins, 1976:121, as £400,000, at least 60 early modern English, 91. Percent of which passed to the crown. During 1536 to 54, a large part of this land, valued at £1.1 million, was sold to the gentry, Stone, 1972, 154, creating the economic basis for the subsequent expansion of the elite class. 3.3 stagflation, 1580 to 1640. Population and economy. The population continued to grow, but at a decelerating rate, reaching 5.3 million during the 1640s, Wrigley et al., 1997. Thus, between 1480 and 1640, the English population more than doubled. The doubling of the population in the 120 years before the Civil War is the critical variable of the period, an event the ramifications of which spread out into every aspect of the society. Stone, 1972:67. Similar statements were also made by other authors, e.g. Russell, 1991, Kishlansky, 1997. One consequence of population growth was a drastic decline in the land-to-peasant ratio. For example, whereas prior to 1560, 57% of land holdings were 1 acre or greater in size, after 1620, only 36% were in that category. Worse, the numbers of landless peasants drastically increased. The proportion of labourers owning only a cottage with garden or croft increased from 11% before 1560 to 40% after 1620, Everett, 1967, nanutrierende. Overall, the price of grain rose almost eightfold from 1500 to 1640. In nominal terms, when expressed in grams of silver, the increase was sixfold. To investigate factors that were responsible for this inflation, Jack Goldstone, 1991, Table 3, fitted a simple regression model with log-transformed population, an index of harvest quality, and time, the dummy variable for technical change, as independent variables to the data. The model explained 99% of the variance in the log-transformed prices and indicated that the most important factor driving inflation was population growth. Expansion of the money supply as a result of the large-scale importation of bullion from the Americas also contributed to the price revolution of the 16th century. However, even in Spain, where the effect should be the greatest, sustained inflation started in 1540 before any substantial amounts of precious metals started arriving from the New World, and continued after 1620 despite declining bullion imports. Fisher, 1996, figure 2.09. Another clue suggesting that the primary mover behind inflation was population growth is the disparity between price increases of food and fuel versus manufactures, Table 3.3. Whereas the price of grain increased almost eightfold, the price of manufactures increased only by a factor of 3. Another indicator suggesting that price inflation was driven primarily by population growth is real wages, which declined by more than 40%. See HAPTER 392. Table 3.3. Relative increases in prices of food and fuel, grain, livestock, and wood versus manufactures. Years grain, livestock, wood manufactures. 1450-6999101147 0-8 910410 2101140 -150910510588898 1510-2913 5128981006 1530 491741641081191550 -6933 2270 570-89412344227227159 -160-957-54331224715433129788649502994. Source: Fisher, 1996:74. Between 1500 and 1640, Allen 2001. Land rents also increased at an accelerating rate, Table 3.4. During the 16th century, rents increased in line with prices, but after 1580 rents rapidly outpaced inflation. As a result, real rents stagnated during the expansion phase, so that the only way for landlords to increase their revenues was to get more land. During the stagflation phase, by contrast, real rents grew rapidly, and the landlords enjoyed a substantial increase in their incomes. For example, the standard of living of the average gentry in Warwickshire increased by nearly 400% between the 1530s and 1630s, Stone 1972-74. Urbanisation and trade. During the 16th century, the growth of the London population largely kept pace with the total population of England. As a result, London had between 2 and 3% of the total population. After 1600, however, the size of London mushroomed to the point where over 10% of the total population resided in it. During the second half of the 18th century and the early 19th century, the growth of London's population again lagged behind that of the country. In 1830, London had 9% of the total population. In other words, urbanisation exhibited the typical secular dynamics, with the peak of urbanisation lagging substantially behind the population peak. Urbanisation was dominated by, but not limited to, London. For example, between 1603 and 1670, the urban population of East Anglia grew by 50%, while the total population of the area rose by only 11%. The largest towns grew fastest. Norwich increased from 12,000 to 30,000 during the 17th century, Clay 1984-20. The dynamics of trade and industry paralleled those of urbanisation. Shipping owned in London rose from 12,300 tons in 1582 to 35,300 tons in 1629, and to about 150,000 tons by 1687-1686, Clay 1984-202. Between EARLYMODERNENGLAND 93. Table 3.4 rents, Kerridge Allen. Year D/acre. Real rent year real rent. 1,515.656 to 1.0, 0146 1.175, 215 235 0.751, 487.5, 1.2, 217153, 513.283, 1.65 1000, 512.5 1.0, 736 1545 13.79 61.37 1537.5 1.3542 1555 20.192 1.2 2 156 2.5 0.78 870 1000 565.2 209 21.3 3 1587.54 0.15711575.285511.511.51612.55.3 0.31687 Source: data from Kerridge, 1953, and Allen, 1992. Note: peaks in real rents are in boldface. 1622 and 1700, the value of imports of food and raw materials to London increased from £1 million to £3 million. Clay, 1984b. The growth of industry can be illustrated with some numbers on iron production. In 1500 this was a mere 140 tonnes per year, but by 1600 it had grown to 10,000 tonnes per year. In 1660, total home iron production rose to 20,000 tonnes. Elites. Between 1540 and 1640, the numbers of the various elite strata expanded much faster than the general population did. See Table 3.1. Whereas the population grew by 80%, from 2.8 to 5.1 million, the elite numbers tripled, from 6,300 to 18,500 aristocratic families. The radical increase in aristocratic numbers affected all elite strata. The number of peers increased from 60 to 160. The number of baronets and knights increased from 500 to 1,400. The number of esquires increased from 800 to 1,203,000, and the number of armigerous gentry increased from 5,000 to 15,000. Stone, 1972-72. As the numbers of the gentry grew, so did their involvement in the local and central government. For example, the number of men appointed justices of the peace in 4 sample counties, Kent, Norfolk, Warwickshire, and the North Riding of Yorkshire, increased from 60 in the late 15th century to 96 in 1562, 166 in 1636, and 180 in 1662. 396 in 1702, Heel and Holmes, 1994, 167, a 6.6-fold increase. The membership of the House of Comcy HAPTER, 394. Mons grew from 300 to 500, while the gentry component in it rose from 50% to 75%, Stone 1972, 92, implying a 2.5-fold increase in the number of gentry MPs. The expansion of the landed elites was accompanied by a rise of professed scions. The numbers of lawyers, doctors, and other practitioners of medicinae and secretarial administrative assistants showed a sustained and striking increase, generally peaking in 1640, Stone 1976, 34. For example, the number of attorneys enrolled in the Court of Common Pleas rose between 1578 and 1633 from 342 to 1,383. The numbers of the clergy also increased, starting in 1560 and reaching a peak in 1,640. Stone 1976:34. The causal factors underlying the rise of the gentry are well understood. In the first phase, roughly 1540 to 60, the gentry profited from the massive land transfer of church property. In the second phase, after 1580, the gentry benefited from rising real rents. Additionally, as the Crown's finances worsened, it was forced to sell more land. The value of the Crown lands sold between 1589 and 1635 was £2.1 million, Stone 1972, 154, and most of it ended up in the hands of the gentry. The rise of the gentry was accompanied by ever-increasing levels of conspicuous consumption, as well as by increasing degree of inequality. In 1485, most English people, even well-to-do, wore similar dress. Women wore plain, loose-fitting garments, and men did likewise. Fine but simple linen was as acceptable in formal costume as ornate silk. The third and fourth decades of the 16th century, however, saw an explosive growth in the consumption of expensive and ornate costume. Demand rose enormously, especially among the wealthy, who purchased expensive brocades, velvets, and silks for new and splendid costumes. During the reign of Elizabeth, men changed their fashions entirely. Their clothes became more elaborate and distinctive. Women matched male attire with exquisitely decorated farthingales and fine damask gowns. The 16th century closed with a wild orgy of extravagance, as the provincial gentry attempted to emulate the London haute monde by wearing extravagant costumes and hats with 12-inch crowns. Berger 2019, jugo till jugoet. At a certain point, however, the elite numbers increased beyond the sustainable level. As a result, competition for jobs and patronage gradually intensified, with all the dire consequences for political stability of the English society. Goldstone, 1991, proposed two ways to quantify intra-elite competition. First, one can examine the data on university enrollments. University enrollments increased drastically during the second half of the 16th century, reaching a peak in 1640. This secular trend was not simply a part of the much longer, millennial increase in the general level of European literacy and education, because by the 1750s, when intra-elite competition had greatly subsided, the enrollments had declined to pre-EAR Lai Mo D Ren and GL and D 95. Figure 3.5 enrollments at Oxford University, 1500 to 1850. 1600 levels, figure 3.5. The universities were turning out an educated clergy and laity in excess of suitable job opportunities, and were thus creating a large and influential group of discontented outs. Stone, 1972-96. The second indicator of intra-elite competition was the amount of litigation among gentry. In 1640, there was probably more litigation per head of population going through the central courts at Westminster than at any time before or since. But 100 years later, in 1750, the common law hit what appears to have been a spectacular all-time low. Brooks, 1989-360. For example, from 1640 to 1750, the number of gentry who appeared in the courts of common pleas as plaintiffs or defendants dropped by over 65%. Brooks, 1989. Thus, the increase in litigation was not simply a result of the rise of the modern society in England. A third indicator of intra-elite competition, in addition to the two posed by Goldstone, was the veritable epidemic of duelling that afflicted the English aristocracy in the late 16th century. The number of duels and challenges mentioned in newsletters and correspondence jumped from 5 in the 1580s to nearly 20 in the 1590s, and then to a peak of 39 in the 1610s. Stone, 1965. The rise of duelling coincided with, and perhaps was a part of, the crime wave that inundated the English society in the late 16th century and peaked in the early 17th. Data on homicides assembled by Eisner, 2003, suggest that the general incidence of crime increased and declined in step with population pressure and inverse real wages, figure 3.6. The state. The final major consequence of population growth was the increasing fiscal strain on the English state. The state revenues were strong under Henry VII and continued to increase until the mid-16th century. After that point, revenues declined in real terms. See figure 3.3. While expenses, see HAPTER 396. Figure 3.6 homicide rate in relation to inverse real wages misery index and population pressure. Continued to rise. The state's fiscal difficulties mounted during the 16th century and reached a peak on the eve of the Great Revolution. Figure 3.7 AA. The basic problem was that the Crown's real expenses increased proportionately to population numbers, while real income declined. Additionally, the expanded elite numbers imposed greater patronage costs on the state. Increasingly, from the mid-16th century on, the Crown was forced to sell assets, levy forced loans, and seek parliamentary grants even in peacetime. Goldstone, 1991-93. By the 1630s, the Crown lands were largely gone, and the unpaid Crown debt reached the point where the interest on it was greater than the ordinary revenues. Furthermore, prior efforts to secure extraordinary revenues had alienated the elites to the point where they were unlikely to acquiesce to further fiscal demands or entreaties by the Crown. Here are some numbers. The state debt grew from £400,000 in 1603 to £900,000 in 1618. Hughes 1991-27. Under Elizabeth, perks of £8,000 per annum were distributed to the peers. Under James I, this figure increased to £105,000. Hughes 1991, 151. By 1626, pensions had increased to £140,000 per year, or about a quarter of the total cash revenues of the Crown. Stone 1965, 419. Some of these pensions were due to legitimate demands of government service, but an increasing part went to fuel the growth of a parasitic court aristocracy preying upon the revenues of the Crown. Stone 1965, 419. In the 1630s, more than half of government revenue was absorbed by official salaries. Clay 1984, B261. EARLYMODERNENGLAND 97. Figure 3.7a, Index of the State's Fiscal Distress, 1550 to 1750. Goldstone, 1991, Figure 4. Goldstone's Index of Fiscal Distress varies from 0, adequate income and credit, to 4, total bankruptcy. Goldstone, 1991, 105. B. Mass Mobilization Poten, TL in England, 1530 to 1750. Goldstone, 1991. 3.4 Crisis, 1640 to 60. The onset of the Civil War. By 1640, the social pressure resulting from population expansion, elite overproduction, and growing state insolvency had reached the breaking point. In his seminal work, Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World, Jack Goldstone, 1991, used several social and political indicators to quantify the growing pressure. The first index is the Mass Mobilization Potential, MMP, of the general populace. One population group is of particular importance, the urbanized workers and artisans, especially in the capital, because they are located near CHAPTER 398. The centers of power. Goldstone proposed three measurable components in the MMP. 1. The degree of misery affecting the urban masses by the dynamics of real wages. 2. Youthful age structure, which increases the mobilization potential of the crowd. And 3. Urban growth, which concentrates the poor young sons and other discontented commoners, and thus should play an important multiplier role in amplifying the popular discontent brought about by increasing poverty. Goldstone proposed a formula combining the effects of these three mechanisms in one measure of mass mobilization potential. The estimated MMP for England during 1530 to 1750 is plotted in figure 3.7b. An increased MMP by itself was not enough to cause the state collapse when the elites were unified and determined to prevent it. Thus, the second trend contributing to state breakdown was the loss of elite unity. A favourable economic conjuncture for landowners during the stagflation phase resulted in the massive expansion of elite numbers. However, the amount of surplus that could be wrung from the peasants stagnated and even declined after 1620. For example, real rents peaked during the first quarter of the 17th century and declined thereafter, Table 3.4. The direct consequence of these two opposing trends was that the average income per elite capita declined on the eve of the Great Revolution. As usually happens, the pain was not spread evenly, and although many elite families were greatly impoverished, others continued to do well. Thus, not only was there a growing segment of elites who faced the prospect of downward mobility, there was also a visible rise in inequality. One avenue for preserving elite status was to seek employment with the state, church, or the magnates. But employment opportunities could not keep pace with the growing numbers of elite aspirants, most of whom had university degrees. Limits on available land, civil and ecclesiastical offices, and royal patronage led to increasingly polarized factional battles between patron-client groups for available spoils. Goldstone 1991, 119. When one elite faction won, it attempted to completely exclude its rivals. This is what happened when the faction led by George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, managed to monopolize the court's patronage from about 1617 to his death in 1628. In the words of David Loades, 1999-308, the ascendancy of Buckingham transformed abuse into a scandal of systematic exploitation. The increasing clamour of the elites for positions aggravated the third trend, the fiscal difficulties of the state. The state finances were also under pressure from rising military costs, from the military revolution of the 16th century. The revenues, however, ultimately failed to match the pace of increased outlays. In fact, real revenues declined during the second half of the 16th century and stagnated from 1600 to 1640, see figure 3.3. Thus, the ability of the state to raise revenue could not keep up with the increasing fiscal demands on it. The Crown used a variety of expedients, EARLYMODERNENGLAND 99, to provide short-term relief: the sale of crown lands, offices and titles, debasement of coinage, and borrowing from the City of London and the international money market. By the 1630s, however, crown lands were gone, and the state debt had reached over £1 million. The state was on the brink of bankruptcy, and it took a very slight shock, the Bishops' Wars, to tip it over the precipice. Economic consequences of the Civil War. The Civil War started in 1642 and lasted with intervals until 1651, followed by a period of continuing political instability until the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. During this period of civil war and governmental confusion, some 10% of the male population was killed. Towns such as Birmingham, 1,643, Bolton, 1,644, and Leicester, 1,645, were sacked. The castles and houses of the nobility and gentry were sacked or destroyed to prevent their use in future campaigns. King 1971:355. Local studies document the extent of property damage. For example, even though Gloucester remained under one side's control throughout the conflict, and its siege was not reckoned to be particularly destructive, a 1,646 investigation found 241 houses destroyed, leaving 1,250 people homeless. And the suburbs were not rebuilt until the 18th century. Warmington, 1997-78. The countryside suffered much more. Almost every village in Inshire, the area around Gloucester, was plundered at least once, and many repeatedly. The Tewkesbury region, also in Gloucestershire, was plundered in 1643, 1644, and 1645. As a result of pillage and heavy taxation imposed by both sides, land values declined so far that tenants refused to pay rents and abandoned their leases. Some villages were reportedly depopulated as a result of the war, Warmington 1997:77. An enormous amount of land changed hands, although much of it was later reversed, including £3.5 million of crown lands, £2.5 million of ecclesiastical lands, and over £1 million of royalist lands, King 1971:355. This transfer of land caused significant dislocation in the countryside. Purchasers of confiscated lands were anxious to secure quick returns, and tenants who could not produce written evidence of their titles were liable to eviction. Hill 1982, 125. The rural poor in England were almost entirely neutral during the 1640s and 1650s. The only serious intervention by the rural poor came in the form of assemblies of the clubmen who gathered in several counties during the latter stages of the war. These interventions were no more than desperate attempts by the rural poor to protect their fields, crops, cattle, and women from the depredations of both armies. Stone, 1972-55. To sum up, the Civil War did enormous damage to the economic infrastructure of England. It appears that the only reason for the very slight CHAPTER 3100 population decline that the country experienced during the 17th century was rapidly increasing agricultural productivity. Thus, wheat yields increased by more than 50% during the 17th century, apparently compensating for the loss of cultivated land resulting from internal warfare. Population. Thanks to work by Wrigley, Schofield, and co-workers on the population reconstruction of the early modern England, we have a firm grasp of the demographic machinery underlying population changes from the mid-16th century to the 19th century. The temporal variation in the population growth rate was due to changes in both birth and death rates, but crude birth and death rates responded with different lags to changes in population numbers. Wrigley, Schofield, and co-workers showed that a large proportion of variance in the crude birth rate could be explained by nuptiality. The proportion of the population never marrying increased from 5% in the mid-16th century to over 25% by 1650, before declining back to 5% during the next 100 years. Wrigley and Schofield, 1981, 262. The average age at first marriage also increased between 1550 and 1650, which had the effect of reducing the average number of children per married woman by at least one, Wrigley et al. 1997.136. The 17th century was an era of steadily worsening mortality that reached a maximum around 1680. There was an improvement around 1700, then another mortality peak during the 1720s, particularly affecting infants and children, Wrigley et al. 1997 இலவசம் 283. The 18th century saw a gradual and not always monotonic improvement in the expectation of life. Migration began growing in 1550, peaked in 1650, and then entered a secular decline until the 1780s. Wrigley and Schofield, 1981, 220. The explanations of the worsening demographic regime are provided by the usual suspects of famine, disease, and war. The worst famine of the period occurred during the years 1594 to 97, which saw the longest run of bad harvests of the 16th century. Clay, 1984 and 19. A generation later, in 1622 to 23, a rise in the price of grain coincided with a severe depression in the cloth industry, leaving many people without money to buy food. There is clear evidence from both periods of deaths from starvation, especially of vagrants, elderly widows, and pauper children. Other subsistence crises followed, but by the middle of the 17th century, widespread famine seems to have become a thing of the past. Clay, 1984 and 19. The plague, which relaxed its grip on the English population by the end of the 15th century, gradually increased during the 16th, Birabin, 1975. The century between 1570 and 1670 was a period of recurrent early modern English 101. Plague epidemics, culminating in the Great Plague of London, 1665. During the late 17th century, the plague suddenly went extinct in England. However, the plague was not the only scourge during the 17th century. Typhus epidemics often flared up when internecine fighting intensified, for example in 1648. The annual death toll of smallpox epidemics in London often exceeded 2,000 during the 1670s. Scott and Duncan, 2001-40. 3.5 Depression, 1660 to 1730. Population stagnation. The population of England declined from the peak of 5.4 million achieved during the 1650s to a trough of 5 million in the 1680s. The period after that was characterized by very slow and uneven growth. The population was still 5.4 million in 1730, and the next period of vigorous growth began only after 1750. The main factor explaining this prolonged period of stagnation appears to be mortality, because fecundity exhibited an increasing trend from 1650 on. However, detailed demographic investigation by Wrigley et al. 1997:298 indicates that adult mortality improved during the 18th century, but this improvement was offset until the 1750s by high infant and child mortality rates. Infanticide indictment rates in England peaked in the very late 17th century and slowly declined in the 18th, figure 3.8, suggesting that high infant mortality during this period may have been a result of a conscious or unconscious attempt at birth control. Thus, the demographic picture is murky and does not tell us much about the possible causes of population stagnation prior to 1750. We believe that 3 factors, 2 endogenous and 1 exogenous, can help us understand this puzzling phenomenon, but not a unique one. A similar period of population stagnation occurred during the Depression phase of the Plantagenet cycle. First, there was a strong negative effect of urbanization on population growth. As we discussed above, the peak of urbanization was considerably lagged with respect to the population peak. Between 1700 and 1750, London had 10% of the country's population, a 4-fold increase from 1580 and slightly greater than the Urbaniza. Tie-in index of 1830, 9%. A high degree of urbanization during the Depression phase of the Tudor cycle without doubt was an important factor contributing to the unfavorable demographic regime. E. A. Wrigley, cited in Clay, 1984-191, calculated that during 1690 to 1710, immigration to London, estimated at 30,000 per year on average, absorbed half of the natural increase of the entire population of the country, The enormous losses that London suffered in the 17th century plagues were made good by the second year after an outbreak. The dampening demographic effect of Chapter 3, 102. Figure 3.8 infanticide indictment rates per 100,000, 1560 to 1800, Roth 2001. London was amplified by the fact that it disproportionately attracted female immigrants, who came in response to the great demand for domestic servants. As a result, there were fewer than 90 men for every 1 Hun. Dread women, Clay 1984 at 209. The sex imbalance served to further depress the ability of population to increase. Second, the data on rents collected by Robert Allen suggests that real rents jumped by 70% from the last quarter of the 17th century to the first quarter of the 18th century. Allen 1992, 172. It is likely that, once the period of intra-elite disunity was over, the elites were in a much better position to turn the screws on the peasants, although the increased rent was partly compensated for by the increase in productivity achieved by English agriculture during the 17th century. It still must have substantially decreased the personal consumption of peasants. This is a very tentative interpretation and not free of problems. For example, real wages during this period generally kept increasing, although they never reached their 15th century maximum. But if peasants were overexploited, this should have spilled over into real wages, which we do not see. Perhaps increased rents simply retarded the growth of the rural population, thus contributing indirectly to slow population growth. This issue requires further investigation. The third factor was the general worsening of the climate in the early 18th century associated with the Maunder minimum of solar active, EAR, Li-Modi RN and GLND 103, ITI. The climate cooling affected Europe from London to Moscow, causing a sequence of crop failures and famines. We know that populations of both France and Russia experienced declines during the first decade of the century, which are usually attributed to the exactions imposed by wars pursued by Louis XIV and Peter I, respectively. However, it is equally possible that the explanation for this pan-European population decline may lie in the exogenous factor of climate. The elites. The civil wars resulted in serious deterioration of the economic position of the landed elites. Particularly affected were the royalists, whose lands were confiscated and sold. The combined value of these properties was over £1.25 million. This land transfer was partially reversed because many royalists bought their estates back before 1660. Hill 1982-126. However, most of them had to incur heavy debt to do so. Nearly £1.5 million was raised from some 3,000 royalists by the Committee of Compounding. On top of these and other exactions came heavy taxation. In order to pay composition fines after a long period of receiving no rents, royalists had to sell part of their lands, and these lands were not restored after 1660. Thus, although the bulk of royalist landlords retained their position, many were greatly impoverished in the process, and some lesser elite families had a stiff fight to keep their heads above water. Hill 1982-126. During the last quarter of the 17th century, almost all landlords experienced a further reduction in their incomes as a result of low agricultural prices and falling rents. Clay 1984A 162. On top of this, again, they had to bear a much great rate of taxation. For example, after 1692 taxes were absorbing 1/5 of the income of many gentry. Many of those at the lower fringes of the gentry had to part with their land. Clay 1984-162. The declining economic fortunes of the gentry were reflected in their consumption patterns, whereas the early 17th century witnessed a rapid expansion in the imports of luxury. Clay 1984-26. After the civil wars, there was significant change of ethos among the elites, leading to a reduction of conspicuous expenditure on houses, clothes, and entertaining. Clay 1984-160. The economic malaise affecting gentry extended into the 18th century. Thus, the average wealth of esquires in Norfolk and Suffolk was £700 in 1628 to 40, and then declined to £330 for the period of 1700 to 40, a drop of more than 50% in real terms. Overton 1996:39. The result was increased downward mobility, with an almost automatic descent by younger sons into lower social strata. For example, in Cumbria between 1680 and 1750, only one younger son of the gentry was able to purchase CHA Peter 3104. Figure 3.9 Replacement rates of peers, 1550 to 1800, Hollingsworth 1964. Land and climb back up into the group, Beckett 1986:23. The upward mobility into the ranks of the gentry was similarly restricted. With a few exceptions, the days when a man of fortune converted his wealth into landed acreage were already numbered by the end of the 17th century, and the practice had more or less disappeared by the mid-18th century. Beckett 1986:69. The numbers of elites shrank from the late 17th century to the middle of the 18th century. Partly this was a result of diminished upward and enhanced downward mobility. Partly it was a result of the elite demographics, Hollingsworth 1964. The replacement rate, average number of adult sons per father among the upper rank elites, declined below 1 after 1650 and kept declining to below 0.8 until the first quarter of the 18th century, figure 3.9. During the next quarter century, it increased to 1.1. But it was not until after 1750 that the replacement rate achieved the healthy level of 1.3 to 1.4 it was to have to the middle of the 19th century. Collectively, the peerage, baronetage, and knighthood totaled only 1,075 by 1760, a fall of 30% since the beginning of the century, and among the lesser gentry in the counties, the position appears to have been much the same. Beckett, 1986-98. These numbers are given in Table 3.5. Overall, elite numbers declined from 18,500 to 13,000. See Table 3.1. As the number of landowning families shrank, the average size of estates tended to increase. Clay 1984A 158 268, EARLYMO DERNENGLAND 105. Table 3.5, numbers of upper rank elites. Year peers, baronets, knights total 1,700, 173,539,291,391,170,000, 170,000, 170,000, 167,924,000, 180,000, 171,000, 170,000, 190,000, 892. 1,180,000, 162,000, 170,000, 130,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000,
170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150,000, 170,000, 150. Source Beckett, 1986. Note, there were also Irish and Scottish peers, not shown here. Consequences of the Civil War. Changed social mood. When the civil wars began in 1642, the English could look back to a century of internal peace. The risings of 1549 were quelled without undue difficulty. The overthrow of Somerset was accomplished without bloodshed. Northumberland's attempt to divert succession collapsed with only a hint of civil war. Mary's regime, although hardly popular, achieved most of its initial objectives and never looked, even at the end, in danger of being overthrown. The harvests of the mid-1550s and the mid-1590s inflicted terrible sufferings upon the poor, but nowhere in England set off the large-scale risings.
Elizabeth crushed the Presbyterian movement and effectively contained the Catholic threat, while Essex's revolt collapsed into black comedy in 24 hours. The succession crisis at the death of Elizabeth was solved dexterously and peacefully. Williams 1995:22. The last peasant revolt serious enough to send gentry fleeing from their homes in terror had been in 1549, and by 1642 generations of gentry had gone by since the Great Fear, and memories had grown dim. Stone, 1972-76. Few among the elites could foresee the depth of the societal collapse that would result from their actions, and the intra-elite conflict was allowed to escalate unchecked until it acquired a dynamic of its own. CHAPTEREETHOUSANDSIX. The 2 decades following 1640 were the most protracted and intense period of socio-political instability in England since the Wars of the Roses. The following 2 decades, after the Stuart Restoration, were in contrast internally a peaceful period. This alternation between civil war and internal stability thus provides another example of a bigenerational cycle. Around 1680, however, social pressure began increasing again. 3 parliaments came and went in rapid succession, 1679 to 81. A reign of legal terror against Whigs and dissenters began in 1682. Several were executed, and others driven into exile. Hill 1982-169. When Charles II died in 1685, he was succeeded peacefully by James II, but the same year 2 risings took place. The Argyll and Monmouth rebellions were rapidly suppressed, but when William of Orange landed in England 3 years later, the rebellion quickly spread, and James II chose to flee England. As a result of this glorious revolution, 1688-90, with aftershocks in Scotland and Ireland until 1692, the Stuart dynasty was abolished, and Parliament offered the crown to William and Mary jointly. One remarkable feature of this revolution was its relative bloodlessness. Whigs and Tories disagreed sharply on a number of issues, but these differences were patched up, largely as a result of men's recollection of what happened 45 years earlier, when unity of the propertied class had been broken. Hill 1982-236. The compromise reached by the elites held up remarkably well throughout the whole of the 18th century and beyond. After the Glorious Revolution, there were no major rebellions in Great Britain, as the Union of England and Scotland was called after 1707, apart from 2 Jacobite risings, one in 1707 and one in 1701, 1715-16, and another in 1745-46. These aftershocks followed the Glorious Revolution at roughly generational intervals. The first one was led by James II's son, and the second by his grandson. The turnaround point, the mid-18th century. By the mid-18th century, the last echoes of the early modern crisis had dissipated. Real wages increased throughout the early 18th century, reaching a peak around 1750. The last serious disturbance of internal peace in Great Britain was the Jacobite Rising in 1745-46. The numbers of the elites reached a minimum sometime around the 1760s. The ruling class achieved an unprecedented degree of unity. After the stabilization of the political system in 1721, landowners drastically reduced the number of both electors and contested elections to Parliament. Stone and Stone 1984:14. The elite cohesiveness allowed them to tax themselves at an unprecedented rate for an early modern society, an ability that served England well during the century-long conflict with France, culminating in the Napoleonic Wars. Thus, by the mid-18th century, EARLYMODERNENGLAND 107. The stage was set for the astonishing demographic, economic, and territorial expansion England was to experience during the next century and a half. 3.6 Conclusion. The demographic, economic, political, and social trends in early modern England, from roughly 1485 to 1730, generally moved in ways that were consistent with the predictions of the demographic structural theory. The case of the English Revolution fits the demographic structural theory particularly well, as was argued earlier by Goldstone, 1991. The 3 ingredients of the revolution were the financial crisis of the state, acute competi, Tion and factionalism among the elites, and the existence of a large body of disaffected commoners who could be mobilised by parliamentary leaders against the royalists in London. Measures of all these processes increased during the second half of the 16th and the early 17th centuries, peaking around 1640. As in the previous case study of the Plantagenet cycle, we found that the operation of the demographic structural machinery was influenced and modified by other factors. The geopolitical environment apparently played a minor role during this cycle, although it was the invasion by the Dutch stadtholder, William of Orange. That precipitated the Glorious Revolution. The success of it was entirely due to internal factors. Long-term fluctuations in climate were probably important in contributing to population stagnation of the late 17th century to early 18th century. During this cycle, there were no traumatic exogenous events comparable to the arrival of the Black Death in 1348. The increase in the incidence of epidemics during the 17th century was apparently an endogenous process. The most important factor outside the core variables of the demographic structural theory was the acceleration of social evolution that eventually resulted in the Industrial Revolution. Because of scientific and agronomic advances, crop yields began increasing shortly after 1600. During the 17th century, yields doubled. As a result, the carrying capacity also doubled. We believe it was this dramatic increase in the carrying capacity that explains why population numbers in England did not collapse to the same degree as happened in, for example, Spain or Germany in the 17th century. When we divide the total population by the estimated carrying capacity, we observe that the resulting variable, the population pressure on resources, oscillates in a very similar fashion to what happened during the Plantagenet cycle, figure 3.10. CHAPTERTHREETWO. Figure 3.10, Population Dynamics in England, 1150 to 1800, see appendix to this chapter. A. Raw population numbers, average yields, and estimated carrying capacity. B. Population pressure, population numbers in relation to carrying capacity in percent of K, and the misery index, inverse real wages. Appendix to Chapter 3, Detrending Population Data. This material is reproduced from Turchin 2005. England 1450 to 1800 population data. Population numbers for the period 1540 to 1800 were taken from Table A.91 in Wrigley et al., 1997. The quinquennial data of Wrigley et al. Were resampled at decadal intervals. For the period 1450 to 1525, population data were taken from Hatcher, 1977, also sampled at 10-year intervals. All data analysed here were sampled at 10-year intervals. The value for 1530 was interpolated. The population data show an increasing long-term trend. EARLYMODERNENGLAND 109. Such non-stationarity violates one of the most important assumptions of nonlinear time series analysis. Thus, the data need to be detrended. Turchin 2003a, 175. Detrending the English population data. The agrarian revolution in England started during the 17th century. Grigg 1989, Allen 1992, Overton 1996. We can trace this revolution using data on long-term changes in grain yields, Grigg 1989, Overton 1996. Average wheat yields in the 13th century were around 10 bushels of grain per acre. Yields declined slightly during the 14th and 15th centuries to 8 bushels per acre, perhaps as a result of the worsening global climate. Even as late as the 1580s, the yields were still at their late medieval level. During the 17th century, however, yields began improving, increasing to circa 15 in 1720 to 21 in the early 19th century, Grigg 1989, column 69. Net yields, subtracting seed corn, were lower. For example, the typical late medieval seeding rates were 2 bushels per acre. Thus, the net yield was only 6 bushels per acre. Net yields from Grigg and Overton are plotted in figure 3.10a. To capture the rising trend, we fitted the data after 1580 with a straight line. See figure 3.10a and note the log scale. The linear relationship appears to be an adequate description of the trend. For example, adding a quadratic term failed to better the regression in a statistically significant fashion. We can obtain an approximate estimate of the carrying capacity by summing that it was proportional to the net yield. assuming a total potentially arable area of 12 million acres, Grig 1989, and that one individual, averaging over adults and children, needed a minimum of 1/4, 8 bushels or 2.9 hectoliters, of grain per year, we calculated the carrying capacity of England, shown by the dashed line in figure 3.10a. By coincidence, 1 bushel of net yield per acre translates exactly into 1 million persons of carrying capacity. We can now detrend the observed population numbers by dividing them by the estimated carrying capacity. The detrended population, which can also be thought of as population pressure on resources, is defined as n prime of t equals n of t over k of t. The critical assumption here is that k is proportional to the net yield. Why? Since y is the only quantity varying with time in the formula. Other components, total arable area, consumption minimum, being constant multipliers, k will wax and wane in step with y. In other words, the exact values of constant multiples do not matter, since we are interested in the relative changes of population pressure. The estimate of k is based not on the area that was actually cultivated, this fluctuated with population numbers, but on the potentially arable area. The latter quantity fluctuated, chapter 3.110. Little across the centuries, for example, as a result of some inundation of coastal areas during the Middle Ages or more recent reclamation using modern methods, and can be approximated with a constant without a series. Oas loss of precision. A test of the appropriateness of this detrending was obtained by regressing the estimated population pressure on real wages reported by Allen 2001. There was a very close inverse relationship between these two variables, and not a very good one if we were to use the non-detrended popular tie-in numbers. As figure 3.10b shows, population pressure and inverse real wages fluctuated virtually in perfect synchrony. Chapter 4. Medieval France, the Capetian cycle, 1150 to 1450. 4.1 Overview of the cycle. The official start of the Capetian dynasty is dated to the accession of Hugh Capet to the French throne in 987. However, before 1200, the Capetian kings of France directly controlled a rather insignificant extent of territory overshadowed by other North French polities, the most important of which were the Normans and the Angevins. The integrative trend set in gradually during the 12th century. The important landmarks were the consolidated tie-in of royal lands under Louis VI, the Fat, 1108 to 37, and the activities of Suger, abbot of Saint Denis. Denis, between 1122 and 1151. For this reason, we date the beginning of the high medieval cycle in France to 1150. The century between 1150 and 1250 was the expansion phase, which saw a rapid growth of population densities and also an enormous expansion of the territory controlled by the French kings. The stagflation phase set in after the mid-13th century, when population growth slowed down and gradually ceased altogether. The onset of the crisis was signaled by the famines of 1315 to 17 and reached a peak with the arrival of the Black Death, followed by military defeats, peasant uprisings, and the First Civil War. A temporary stabilization was achieved during the 1360s, but it proved to be a very fragile one. The Depression phase, characterized by high socio-political instability and the absence of sustained population growth, lasted until the mid-15th century. It was around 1450 when the new integrative trend became obvious, so we take this date as the end of the medieval cycle and the beginning of the early modern one. As before, our dates for the cycles and phases within cycles are provi. Cyanal and subject to change should new evidence be forthcoming. They are also fuzzy, in that a specific date had to be selected within a broad penumbra of events occurring in the 10 or 20 years surrounding it. Thus, the date of 1450 really means 1440 to 60, or even 1430 to 70. Our division of a continuous cycle into discrete stages is a useful device for organizing the presentation, but does not mean that transitions between successive phases occurred abruptly in a single year. The large and spatially heterogeneous entity of the Kingdom of France offers further challenges to historical analysis. The country we know as CHAPTER 4112. Modern France was, in the medieval period, an aggregation of different polities and cultural regions, which could and did move out of synchrony with one another. The chronology that follows, then, is primarily relevant to the territorial core of the French state, the region north of the Loire in Hab. Aided by the speakers of Langue d'Oil, Planhol, 1994, 124. Population and economy. There were perhaps 6 million people in France around 1100, and close to 20 million in 1328, Braudel 1988, 137. Such a tripling of the population during the 12th and 13th centuries, with the fastest growth concentrated in the century around 1200, was quite typical of Western European countries. Abel, 1980. During the century after the Black Death, the French population declined to around 10 million people, figure 4.1a. These numbers refer to the population within modern French borders. The peak population in the area controlled by the Capetians was smaller, perhaps around 16 million, Assumption 1991:10. In 1328, the officials of the royal treasury counted nearly 2,470,000 households. The great fiefs and princely appanages not taxed by the king were excluded. The dynamics of food prices, when expressed in silver equivalents, exhibited a very similar pattern to population dynamics. A 13th century increase, followed by a decline to a minimum toward the mid-15th century, figure 4.1b. There are also shorter-term oscillations of about 50 years superimposed on the secular cycles. Social structure. At the top of the power hierarchy of France stood the great territorial magnates, lay lords, the king, dukes, counts, and barons, and prelates, abbots, bishops, and archbishops. Below them were the middle and lower rank elites, from the more substantial knights to the relatively poor country squires, Tushman, 1978. A view of the typical incomes of various elite substrata is provided by Edouard Perroy's 1962 study of the nobility of the county of Forez, south-central France, in the late 13th century. At the top of the local hierarchy stood the Count of Forez, with 12,000 livres viennois, LV, of annual income. Below him were 2 or 3 barons with incomes of between 1,000 and 2,000 livres per year. 20 or so substantial knights, each with a castle, enjoyed incomes between 100 and 500 LV. The holders of fortified houses were worse off, with incomes of 50 to 100 LV per year. At the bottom of the noble hierarchy were about 100 lesser gentry, whose incomes varied between 25 and 50 livres per year. To put this income in perspective, the basic minimum on which a single person could live in modest comfort at the time was 5 livres. This was the medieval France 113. Figure 4.1 Demographic, economic, and territorial dynamics of France, 1150 to 1850. A. Population within the modern borders of France. Note the logarithmic scale, after Braudel 1988 and Dupaquier 1988a. B. Wheat price in grams of silver per 100 kilograms. Data from Abel 1980. C. Territory of the French state in millions of square kilometers. M squared. Reed 1996. Typical allowance provided to a young nobleman attending university, or a pension to a widow of the lesser gentry. In other words, 25 LV per year was enough to maintain a family of 4 or 5, but left no surplus for status seeking. A sum of 25 livres at that time was equivalent to £5. Thus, the minimum incomes of the lesser gentry in France and in England were essentially the same. The substantial knight in Forez with a minimum in CHAPTER 4114. Come of 100 LV had his counterpart in an English knight or esquire with £20 per annum. The elite numbers changed dramatically during the cycle. Around 1300, the proportion of noble households in the population varied between 1 and 4%, depending on the region. Contaminé, 1997, 50 to 52. The average was 2.4%, a figure that Philippe Contaminé, however, has cautiously lowered to 1.8%, Contaminé 1997:53. Assuming a population of 20 million and 5 persons per household yields an estimate of 70,000 noble families in 1300. A century and a half later, Contaminé 1997-56 estimates the proportion of nobles to the total population had declined to 1.5%. Assuming a population near the 10 million mark in the middle of the 15th century, this produces an estimate of 30,000 noble families at the end of the cycle. Political dynamics. The early Capetian kings ruled a tiny area centered on Paris and Orléans in northern France. The situation changed dramatically during the 12th century, when the Norman state experienced protracted civil war and change of dynasty. Under Philip II Augustus, 1180 to 1223, the territory directly controlled by the French state expanded enormously, so that in 1223 it was 10 times as large as the territory controlled by Hugh Capet, figure 4.1c. During most of the 12th century, thus, France was at war with England under first the Norman and then the Angevin dynasties, a period of conflict sometimes called the First 100 Years' War. Pillage, murder, banditry, and insecurity were part of everyday life. Brodel, 1988, 133. This period of instability, associated with the Capetian conquest of France, which included such violent episodes as the Albigensian Crusades, is clearly reflected in the temporal distribution of coin hoards, figure 4.2. Once the boundaries of the kingdom expanded, however, the central regions began to enjoy the benefits of the peace. Most of the decades of the 13th century and the first half of the 14th century have yielded relatively few hordes, figure 4.2. There is a minor upward fluctuation during the second decade of the 14th century, perhaps associated with the baronial rebellion at the end of Philip IV's reign. But the next major peak of instability was brought about by the collapse of the state in the 1350s and 1360s, figure 4.2. Unfortunately, the third volume of Jean Duplessis' Les Trésors monétaires médiévaux et modernes découverts en France has not been published, and thus we lack information on this extremely useful indicator for the period after 1385. MEDIE-VALFRANCE 115. Figure 4.2. Temporal distribution of the French coin hoards, 1100 to 1385, Duplessis 1985. 4.2 expansion, 1150 to 1250. Demographic data are hard to come by for the medieval period. Table 4.1 gathers together several estimates on the number of surviving children in a family from various sources. This is a good statistic because it integrates over fecundity and survival to adulthood, and because it is directly related to the population growth rate. Cross comparisons of different localities and of different social strata are not valid, but temporal changes within each dataset are in general agreement. There was apparently a slowing of population growth during the 10th and 11th centuries, although the data are very crude. What is clear is that replacement rates tended to increase during the 12th century, table 4.1. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the population of France must have tripled from 6 million to 20 million, figure 4.1a. The economic base for this enormous population build-up had to come primarily from the expansion of cultivated lands. As a result of massive internal colonization, farmland expanded at the expense of heath, forest, and marsh. It is estimated that out of 26 million hectares of forest cover in France in 1000, one half was destroyed by 1300. Brodel, 1988, 140. To appreciate the Magne chapter 4, 116. Table 4.1. Average number of children per family in France, 800 to 1500. Time period, number, area, source. 9e siècle 2,5 polyptyque d'Irminon, Reinhard et al. 1968:65. 980 to 1054.5. The Reach of Maconnais Dupaquier et al. 1988 : 214. 10th century 3.8. Nobility, Northern France, Reinhard et al. 1968:69. 1000 to 1054.2. Nobility, Northern France, Reinhard et al. 1968:69. 1050 to 1103.8. Nobility, Northern France, Reinhard et al. 1968:69. 1100 to 1155.5. Nobility, Northern France, Reinhard et al. 1968:69. 1150 to 1200 5.6. Nobility, Northern France, Reinhard et al. 1968:69. 1200 to 1254.9. Nobility, Northern France, Reinhard et al. 1968:69. 1250 to 1305.1. Nobility, Northern France, Reinhard et al. 1968:69. 1025 3 to 4. Nobility, Picardy, Dupaquier et al. 1988a, 215. 1054 to 4.5 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 215. 1075 greater than 4 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 215. 1105 to 6 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 215. 1075 to 1105.06 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. Min 1988A, infin 1100 to 1125, 4.52 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. Min 1988A to fin 1125 to 1154.70 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 215. 1150 to 1175, 4.92 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 215. 1175 to 1205.40 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. Vows, 1908 15s, 1200 to 1225, 5.54 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 215s, 1225 to 1255.24 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 215, 1250 to 1275, 5.08 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 215. 1275 to 1305.32 nobility, Picardie Dupaquier et al. 1988A, Fein. 1245 to 1304.00 urban elite, Périgueux Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 302. 1300 to 1332.75 urban elite, Périgueux Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 302. 1330 to 1371.91 urban elite, Périgueux Dupaquier et al. Vorsas 1900 accrédité 302. 1370 to 1402.29 urban elite, Périgueux Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 302. 1400 to 1431.82 urban elite, Périgueux Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 302. 1430 to 1472.35 urban elite, Périgueux Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 302. 1470 to 1503.55 urban elite, Périgueux Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 302. 1350 to 1375, 1.81 Arles Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 387. 1391 to 1395, 1.75 Arles Dupaquier et al. 1988A, 387. 1471 to 1475, 1.03 Arles Dupaquier et al. That's 1988, 387. Note, maximum values are in bold, minimum values are in italic. Tude of this land clearance, the total arable land of modern France is 18 million hectares, CIA 2002. It is difficult to estimate, though, how much new land was actually brought into production. Estimates of the increase range from a conservative 40% to a more optimistic 100%. Carpentier and Lemaine, 1996:158. The increase in cultivated area was probably accompanied by increased yields per unit of area. Thus, Carpentier and Lemaine, 1996:161, suggest that yields increased from 3 to 4.1 before the MEDIEVA LFRA NCE 117. 12th century and 4 to 5 to 1 toward 1180. This translates into a 40% increase in net yield. An expanding population, coupled with growing productivity, or at least productivity not decreasing as a result of diminishing returns, and there is no evidence of diminishing returns prior to 1250, should have translated into healthy state finances. Indeed, the century around 1200 saw a great expansion of royal revenues. Accounts for the year 1202-3 suggest that the ordinary revenues of Philip Augustus were about 115,000 livres parisis LP, and that these had increased by 72% since the beginning of his reign in 1180, Henneman 1999, 104, gross receipts in 1202-3, including revenue raised for the war against the Plantagenets, amounted to 196,327 LP. Hallam and Everard, 2001, 226. Louis IX's fixed annual revenue was probably between 200,000 and 250,000 livres parisis by 1250, Hallam and Everard 2001, 311, twice that of Philip Augustus. Thus, real revenues grew substantially, since the price of grain increased between 1200 and the 1250s by only 20%, figure 4.1b. Increasing revenues underwrote state expansion, which brought in more potential taxpayers in a kind of a virtuous cycle. This dynamic probably explains the explosive growth of the Capetian state during this period. 4.3 stagflation, 1,250 to 1,315. Population and economy. At some point during the second half of the 13th century, the rate of growth of agricultural production started to lag behind that of population. The reclamation of land ceased between 1230 and 1280 in most provinces. Brodel 1988:155. Carpentier and Lemene 1996:331. Shortly thereafter, at some point between 1280 and 1315, the population reached its peak. There is mild disagreement among different authorities on the date of the peak. Most likely, different regions peaked at different times. There is no reason to expect a perfect synchrony. For example, Carpentier and Lemene 1996:314 suggest that the population of the Midi may have continued to expand as late as 1340. Population growth was reflected in the rise of prices, figure 4.1b. The price of wheat increased through the 13th century, but the worst period of inflation was from the 1250s to the 1310s, when the price of a quintal of wheat went from 24 to 66 grams of silver, Abel 1980. There are no systematic wage data for medieval France, but pay rates for soldiers suggest that nominal wages increased, although they did not keep pace with inflation, table 4.2. What is interesting is that the real wages declined for both elite and commoner soldiers, but the commoners suffered more. We saw a similar dynamic in the wages of English soldiers. See Chapter 2. CHAPTER 4118. Table 4.2. Daily rates of pay for soldiers in France. Pay rate 1202-1295. Night nominal LT 7S. 6 tedi 10 12 6 days or 15 seconds. In silver 25.1 grams, 41.8 grams. In wheat 1.71 hectoliters, 1.06 hectoliters. Foot soldier nominal, lieutenant 10 days, 12 days. In silver 2.8 grams, 3.3 grams. In wheat 0.19 hectoliters, 0.08 hectoliters. Source: Contamine 1984:94. Note: units LT, livre tournois, G, gram, HL, hectoliter, S, sou, D, denier. The pressure of population also translated into progressive fragmentation of peasant land holdings. In Dauphine, 75% of peasants had less than 2 hectares of farmland. In Hainaut, 60% held 1 hectare or less. Carpentier and Lemene, 1996, 328. This amount of land was far below the level needed to feed a peasant family. Estimates of the production budgets of peasant holdings suggest that the minimum land allowing a comfortable living was around 6 hectares. Carpentier and Lemene, 1996, 340. Assuming a 3-field system and an average harvest of 10 hectoliters per hectare, 6 hectares should yield 40 hectoliters every year. From this, the peasant had to pay the tithe of 1/9 and terrage of 1/7, leaving him with 30 hectoliters. After reserving 8 hectoliters for seed, the peasant and the family had at its disposal 22 hectoliters, 16 quintals, of grain for personal consumption, enough for a family of 4 to 5 people. However, only a small minority of peasants, less than 20%, had land of 6 hectares or more, Carpentier and Lemene, 1996. Thus, the huge majority of rural households did not have enough land to feed themselves, and their very existence critically depended on securing outside employment. The result of this process was a vast and growing rural proletariat. In a vain hope of finding employment, many of the rural poor migrated to towns, further depressing urban real wages, Carpentier and Lemene, 1996:357, as well as fueling the remarkable urban growth. As land became scarce, its price shot up. In Normandy, an acre of land at the beginning of the 13th century cost 2 livres. A century later, it went for 20 livres. In Picardy, a price of a journal, approximately 0.4 hectares. During the first half of the 13th century varied between 1 and 3, at most 4 livres. During the second half of the century, prices went above 4 livres per journal, and toward 1300 they fluctuated between 6 and 10 livres. There were some regional variations, however. At Beaumont-le-Roger, for example, land prices rose until 1260 and then stagnated until 1313. In Beauce, near Chartres, there was actually a tendency for prices to decline. Medievalfrance 119. Figure 4.3, Distinct Dynamics of Urban and Rural Development. A. Dynamics of Planted Towns, Beresford 1967. B. Number of assarts mentioned in documents, Fossier 1968. Land rents increased even faster than prices. For example, in just 40 years between 1276 and 1316, rents around Lille increased fivefold, Carpentier and Le Maine 1996, 334, 336. While the rural population grew ever more slowly and eventually stagnated during this period, the urban population increased rapidly. Large numbers of new towns appeared during the 13th century, with a particularly frenetic pace of urban development after 1250, figure 4.3a. Over 70% of planted towns in France outside Gascony appeared during the stagflation period, 1250 to 1315, Beresford 1967. Rural development, as measured by the number of assarts mentioned in the documents, figure 4.3b, thus preceded urban development. Rural land clearance was concentrated in the expansion phase, while the bulk of urban expansion fell within the stagflation phase. During the 13th century, the population of Paris doubled, figure 4.4a, and it kept on increasing during the next century. The number of cities having populations between 10,000 and 20,000 increased to 20 or so, and there were a dozen in the 20,000 to 50,000 range, Carpentier and CHA PT ER 4120. Figure 4.4 Dynamics of Urbanization in France, 1200 to 1850. A. Population of Paris, Chandler 1987. B. An index of urbanization, defined as the proportion of the population in the capital. Lemmenemil 996,317. Cities grew partly because of the influx of migrants from rural areas, partly because of increasing trade and crafts. But city walls also offered protection, and as socio-political instability increased, growing numbers of rural dwellers abandoned exposed plateaus and moved to the relative safety of fortified towns and cities. Elite overproduction. There is abundant, although largely anecdotal, evidence of elite overproduction developing toward the end of the stagflation phase, summarized, for example, by Jonathan Sumption, 1991, 30 to 32. The main problem of Medievalfrance minor noblemen was the smallness of their holdings, the result of generations of pious bequests and family partitions. Primogeniture was never rig idly applied even in the west and north of France, where it was theoretically the rule of law. Elsewhere, it was not even accepted in principle. As a result, by the beginning of the 14th century, the holdings of much of the lesser nobility had been reduced to barely workable parcels. Sumption 1991-31. The situation was particularly dire in Ile-de-France. At least a quarter of the noble vassals of the Parisian abbeys and the crown had an annual income of less than 10 livres. Data of Guy Forquin cited in Sump, Thion 1991-31. Many petty nobles mortgaged their land or sold it to rich peasants. In the century to come, the survivors of this pauperized gentry would turn to war for their living and finally to brigandage. Sumption 1991-32. The state. During the stagflation period, royal revenues increased in nominal terms but could not keep up with inflation. Louis IX's ordinary revenues were around 0.25 million LT, around 1250, Cuyper 1988-62, Henneman 1999-104. By the late 13th century, the annual income of Philip IV had climbed to between 0.4 and 0.6 million LT, Cuyper 1988. Thus, nominal income perhaps doubled, but prices also doubled. Philip's son, Charles IV, 1322-28, received average net ordinary revenues of 0.28 million LT, which in real terms amounted to only 53% of what his father had enjoyed 30 years earlier. Henneman, 1999-109. The accession of Philip VI, 1328–50, brought the vast appanage of the Valois family into the royal domain, but his ordinary revenues, in real terms, amounted to only 80% of those available to Philip IV. Henneman, 1999-109. 4.4 Crisis, 1315–65. Population collapse. By the early 14th century, France, as well as most of Western Europe, was literally crammed with people. The ecosystem, to use Leroy-Laduree's term, was strained to the breaking point and on the verge of collapse. The collapse experienced during the 14th century was the result of a